Sacred Economics. Part 1. The economics of separation. The converging crises of our time all arise from a common root that we might call separation. Taking many forms: the human nature split, the disintegration of community, the division of reality into material and spiritual realms. Separation is woven into every aspect of our civilization. It is also unsustainable. It generates great and growing crises that are propelling us into a new era, an age of reunion. Separation is not an ultimate reality, but a human projection, an ideology, a story. As in all cultures, our defining story of the people has two deeply related parts, a story of self, and a story of the world. The first is the discrete and separate self, a bubble of psychology, a skin-encapsulated soul, a biological phenotype driven by its genes to seek reproductive self-interest, a rational actor seeking economic self-interest, a physical observer of an objective universe, a mote of consciousness in a prison of flesh. The second is the story of ascent, that humanity, starting from a state of ignorance and powerlessness, is harnessing the forces of nature and probing the secrets of the universe, moving inexorably toward our destiny of complete mastery over, and transcendence of, nature. It is a story of the separation of the human realm from the natural, in which the former expands and the latter is turned progressively into resources, goods, property, and, ultimately, money. Money is a system of social agreements, meanings, and symbols that develops over time. It is, in a word, a story, existing in social reality along with such things as laws, nations, institutions, calendar and clock time, religion, and science. Stories bear tremendous creative power. Through them we coordinate human activity, focus attention and intention, define roles, and identify what is important and even what is real. Stories give meaning and purpose to life and therefore motivate action. Money is a key element of the story of separation that defines our civilization. Part I of Sacred Economics illuminates the economic system that has arisen on the foundation of the story of separation. Anonymity, depersonalization, polarization of wealth, endless growth, ecological despoliation, social turmoil, and irremediable crisis are built into our economic system so deeply that nothing less than a transformation of our defining story of the people will heal it. My intention is that by identifying the core features of the economics of separation, we may be empowered to envision an economics of reunion as well, an economics that restores to wholeness our fractured communities, relationships, cultures, ecosystems, and planet. Chapter 1. The Gift World. Even after all this time the sun never says to the earth, "You owe me." Look what happens with a love like that, it lights the whole sky. Hafiz. In the beginning was the gift. We are born helpless infants, creatures of pure need with little resource to give, yet we are fed, we are protected, we are clothed and held and soothed, without having done anything to deserve it, without offering anything in exchange. This experience, common to everyone who has made it past childhood, informs some of our deepest spiritual intuitions. Our lives are given us, therefore, our default state is gratitude. It is the truth of our existence. Even if your childhood was horrific, if you are reading this right now, at least you are given enough to sustain you to adulthood. For the first years of life, none of this was anything you earned or produced. It was all a gift. Imagine walking out the door right now and finding yourself plunged into an alien world in which you are completely helpless, unable to feed or clothe yourself, unable to use your limbs, unable even to distinguish where your body ends and the world begins. Then huge beings come and hold you, feed you, take care of you, love you. Wouldn't you feel grateful? In moments of clarity, perhaps after a narrow brush with death, or upon accompanying a loved one through the death process, we know that life itself is a gift. We experience an overwhelming gratitude at being alive. We walk in wonderment at the riches, undeserved and freely available, that come with life, the joy of breathing, the delights of color and sound, the pleasure of drinking water to quench thirst, the sweetness of a loved one's face. This sense of mixed awe and gratitude is a clear sign of the presence of the sacred. We feel the same reverence and gratitude when we apprehend the magnificence of nature, the miraculous complexity and order of an ecosystem, an organism, a cell. They are impossibly perfect, far beyond the capacity of our minds to conceive, to create, even to understand more than a tiny part of. Yet they exist, without our ever having to create them, an entire world to sustain and environ us. We don't have to understand exactly how a seed germinates and grows, we don't have to make it happen. Even today, the workings of a cell, an organism, an ecosystem are largely a mystery. Without needing to engineer it, without needing even to understand its inner workings, we still receive nature's fruits. Can you imagine the wonder, the gratitude, of our early ancestors as they contemplated the undeserved provenance the world gave them so freely? No wonder ancient religious thinkers said that God made the world, and no wonder they said God gave the world to us. The first is an expression of humility, the second of gratitude. Sadly, later theologians twisted this realization to mean, God gave us the world to exploit, to master, to dominate. Such an interpretation is contrary to the spirit of the original realization. Humility knows that this gift is beyond our ability to master. Gratitude knows that we honor, or dishonor, the giver of a gift by how we use it. Modern cosmology also affirms the mythological recognition of universe as gift. Is not the Big Bang something, indeed everything, for nothing? This feeling is strengthened by closer examination of the various constants of physics, speed of light, electron mass, relative strengths of the four fundamental forces, etc., all of which inexplicably have the precise values necessary for a universe containing matter, stars, and life. It is as if the whole universe were constructed for us, so that we might exist. In the beginning was the gift, in the archetypal beginning of the world, at the beginning of our lives, and in the infancy of the human species. Gratitude therefore is natural to us, so primal, so elemental that it is very difficult to define. Perhaps it is the feeling of having received a gift, and the desire to give in turn. We might therefore expect primitive people, connected with this primal gratitude, to enact it in their social and economic relationships. Indeed, they did. Most accounts of the history of money begin with primitive barter, but barter is a relative rarity among hunter-gatherers. The most important mode of economic exchange was the gift. Primal though it is, gratitude and the generosity flowing from it coexist with other, less savory, aspects of human nature. While I believe in the fundamental divinity of human beings, I also recognize that we have embarked on a long sojourn of separation from that divinity, and created a world in which ruthless sociopaths rise to wealth and power. This book doesn't pretend such people don't exist, nor that such tendencies don't exist in everyone. Rather, it seeks to awaken the spirit of the gift that is latent within us, and to construct institutions that embody and encourage that spirit. Today's economic system rewards selfishness and greed. What would an economic system look like that, like some ancient cultures, rewarded generosity instead? Let us begin by better understanding the dynamics of the gift. I referred to economic exchange above, but that is generally not an accurate description of gift community. Circulation is a better word. Today we often exchange gifts, but gift exchange is already a step toward barter. In ancient communities, elaborate customs governed gift-giving, customs that persist today in societies that have not completely lost their connection to the past. Usually gift networks are closely tied to kin networks. Customs dictate who gives to whom. To some kin categories you might be expected to give, from others you might expect to receive, and in others the gifts flow in both directions. While gifts can be reciprocal, just as often they flow in circles. I give to you, you give to someone else. And eventually someone gives back to me. A famous example is the Kula system of the Trobriand Islanders, in which precious necklaces circulate in one direction from island to island, and bracelets in the other direction. first described in depth by the anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski. Kula, which literally means circle, is the linchpin of a vast system of gifts and other economic exchanges. Marcel Mauss describes it as follows. The system of gift through exchange permeates all the economic, tribal, and moral life of the Trobriand people. It is impregnated with it, as Malinowski very neatly expressed it. It is a constant give and take. The process is marked by a continuous flow in all directions of presents given, accepted, and reciprocated. While the pinnacle of the Kula system is the highly ritualized exchange of ceremonial bracelets and necklaces by chiefs, the gift network surrounding it extends to all kinds of utilitarian items, food, boats, labor, and so forth. Outright barter, according to Mauss, is unusual. In any event, generally, even what has been received and comes into one's possession in this way in whatever manner is not kept for oneself, unless one cannot do without it. In other words, gifts flow continuously, only stopping in their circulation when they meet a real, present need. Here is Lewis Hyde's poetic description of this principle of the gift. The gift moves toward the empty place. As it turns in its circle, it turns towards him who has been empty-handed the longest, and if someone appears elsewhere whose need is greater, it leaves its old channel and moves towards him. Our generosity may leave us empty, but our emptiness then pulls gently at the hole until the thing in motion returns to replenish us. Social nature abhors a vacuum. While today we clearly distinguish between a gift and a commercial transaction, in past times this distinction was by no means clear. Some cultures, such as the Toripi and Namau, had but a single word to designate buying, selling, lending, and borrowing, while the ancient Mesopotamian word sm meant both buy and sell. This ambiguity persists in many modern languages. Chinese, German, Danish, Norwegian, Dutch, Estonian, Bulgarian, Serbian, Japanese, and many others each have but a single term for borrowing and lending, perhaps a vestige of an ancient time when the two were not distinguished. It even persists in English among less educated speakers, who sometimes use the word borrow to mean lend, as in I borrowed him $20. How could this be? How could the same word apply to two opposite operations? The solution to this puzzle lies in the dynamics of the gift. With the rare, perhaps theoretical, exceptions that Derrida called free gifts, gifts are accompanied either by some token of exchange or by a moral or social obligation, or both. Unlike a modern money transaction, which is closed and leaves no obligation, a gift transaction is open-ended, creating an ongoing tie between the participants. Another way of looking at it is that the gift partakes of the giver, and that when we give a gift, we give something of ourselves. This is the opposite of a modern commodity transaction, in which goods sold are mere property, separate from the one who sells them. We all can feel the difference. You probably have some treasured items that were given you, that are perhaps objectively indistinguishable from something you might buy, but that are unique and special because of who gave them to you. Thus it was that ancient people recognized that a magical quality, a spirit, circulates along with gifts. Useless objects like cowrie shells, pretty beads, necklaces, and so on were the earliest money. To exchange them for something of utilitarian value is, naively speaking, merely a way to facilitate a gift something for nothing. They turn it into something for something, but that doesn't make it any less a gift, because they are merely giving physical form to the felt sense of obligation. They are tokens of gratitude. From this perspective, the identity of buying and selling, borrowing and lending, is easy to understand. They are not opposite operations at all. All gifts circle back to the giver in another form. Buyer and seller are equal. Today there is an asymmetry in commercial transactions, which identifies the buyer as the one giving money and receiving goods and the seller as the one receiving money and giving goods. But we could equally say the buyer is selling money for goods, and the seller is buying money with goods. Linguistic and anthropological evidence indicates that this asymmetry is new, far newer than money. What has happened to money, then, to create this asymmetry? Money is different from every other commodity in the world, and, as we shall see, it is this difference that is crucial in making it profane. Gifts, on the other hand, we intuitively recognize as sacred, which is why even today we make ceremonies of giving presents. Gifts embody the key qualities of the sacredness I discussed in the introduction. First, uniqueness. Unlike the standardized commodities of today, purchased in closed transactions with money and alienated from their origins, gifts are unique to the extent that they partake of the giver. Second, wholeness, interdependency. Gifts expand the circle of self to include the entire community. Whereas money today embodies the principle, more for me is less for you, in a gift economy, more for you is also more for me because those who have give to those who need. Gifts cement the mystical realization of participation in something greater than oneself which, yet, is not separate from oneself. The axioms of rational self-interest change because the self has expanded to include something of the other. The conventional explanation of how money developed that one finds in economics texts assumes barter as a starting point. From the very beginning, competing individuals seek to maximize their rational self-interest. This idealized description is not supported by anthropology. Barter, according to Mauss, was rare in Polynesia, rare in Melanesia, and unheard of in the Pacific Northwest. Economic anthropologist George Dalton emphatically concurs, barter, in the strict sense of moneyless exchange, has never been a quantitatively important or dominant model or transaction in any past or present economic system about which we have hard information. The only instances of barter, says Dalton, were for petty, infrequent, or emergency transactions just as is the case today. Aside from these, moneyless transactions scarcely resembled the impersonal, utility-maximizing transactions of economists' fantasies, but rather tended to require lasting, and sometimes ritualized, personal relationships sanctioned by custom and characterized by reciprocity. Such transactions should not be called barter at all, but rather ritualized gift exchange. Today we put gifts and purchases into separate, exclusive categories. To be sure, different economics and psychology apply to each. But very ancient times bore no such dichotomy, nor was there today's distinction between a business relationship and a personal relationship. Economists, in telling the history of money, tend to project this modern distinction backward, and with it some deep assumptions about human nature, the self, and the purpose of life, that we are discrete and separate selves competing for scarce resources to maximize our self-interest. I won't say that these assumptions are not true. They are part of the defining ideology of our civilization, a story of the people that is now drawing to a close. This book is part of the telling of a new story of the people. The transformation of money is part of a larger transformation, founded on very different assumptions about self, life, and world. Human economy is never very far from cosmology, religion, and the psyche. It was not only ancient economies that were based on gifts, ancient cosmology and religion were too. Today as well, our money with its qualities of standardization, abstraction, and anonymity is aligned with many other aspects of the human experience. What new scientific, religious, or psychological paradigms might arise in the context of a different kind of money? If money did not arise from the economist's imaginary world of calculated, interest-maximizing barter, then how did it arise? I propose that it arose as a means to facilitate gift-giving, sharing, and generosity, or at least that it bore something of that spirit. To recreate a sacred economy, it is necessary to restore to money that original spirit. At its core, money is a beautiful concept. Let me be very naive for a moment so as to reveal this core, this spiritual, if not historical, essence of money. I have something you need, and I wish to give it to you. So I do, and you feel grateful and desire to give something to me in return. But you don't have anything I need right now. So instead you give me a token of your gratitude, a useless, pretty thing like a wampum necklace or a piece of silver. That token says, I have met the needs of other people and earned their gratitude. Later, When I receive a gift from someone else, I give them that token. Gifts can circulate across vast social distances, and I can receive from people to whom I have nothing to give while still fulfilling my desire to act from the gratitude those gifts inspire within me. On the level of a family, clan, or hunter-gatherer band, money is not necessary to operate a gift economy. Nor is it necessary in the next larger unit of social organization, the village or tribe of a few hundred people. There, if I don't need anything from you now, either you will, acting from gratitude, give me something that I need in the future, or you will give to someone else, who gives to someone else, who gives to me. This is the circle of the gift, the basis of community. In a tribe or village, the scale of society is small enough that those who give to me recognize my gifts to others. Such is not the case in a mass society like ours. If I give generously to you, the farmer in Hawaii who grew my ginger or the engineer in Japan who designed my cell phone display won't know about it. So instead of personal recognition of gifts, we use money, the representation of gratitude. The social witnessing of gifts becomes anonymous. Money becomes necessary when the range of our gifts must extend beyond the people we know personally. Such is the case when economic scale and the division of labor exceed the tribal or village level. Indeed, the first money appeared in the first agricultural civilizations that developed beyond the Neolithic village, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and India. Traditional, decentralized gift networks gave way to centralized systems of redistribution, with the temple, and later the royal palace, as the hub. Quite possibly, these evolved from potlatch-type traditions in which gifts flowed to chiefs and other leaders, and then back from them to their kin and tribe. Starting as centralized nodes for a large-scale flow of gifts, they soon diverged from the gift mindset as contributions became forced and quantified, and outward disbursement became unequal. Ancient Sumerian documents already speak of economic polarization, haves and have-nots, and wages that were barely at subsistence. While centralized directives, and not market trade, governed the movement of goods, the early agricultural empires also used what some call money, agricultural and metallic commodities in standard measured units that served as media of exchange, units of account, and stores of value. So already, 4,000 years ago, money was failing to meet my naive expectation that it would create greater abundance for all by facilitating the meeting of gifts and needs. By facilitating trade, motivating efficient production, and allowing the accumulation of capital to undertake large-scale projects, money should enrich life, it should bestow upon us ease, leisure, freedom from anxiety, and an equitable distribution of wealth. Indeed, conventional economic theory predicts all of these results. The fact that money has become an agent of the opposite anxiety, hardship, and polarization of wealth presents us with a paradox. If we are to have a world with technology, with cinema and symphony orchestras, with telecommunications and great architecture, with cosmopolitan cities and world literature, we need money, or something like it, as a way to coordinate human activity on the vast scale necessary to create such things. I have therefore written this book, to describe a system that restores to money the sacredness of the gift. I say restore because from the earliest times, money has had sacred or magical connotations. Originally, it was the temples where agricultural surpluses were stored and redistributed. The center of religious life was also the center of economic life. Some authors claim that the earliest symbolic money, as opposed to commodity money, was issued by temples and could be redeemed for sacred sex with temple prostitutes. In any event, it is certain that temples were deeply involved in issuing early coins, many of which bore the images of sacred animals and deities. This practice continues today with bills and coins bearing the likenesses of deified presidents. Perhaps someday we won't need money to have a gift economy on the scale of billions of humans. Perhaps the money I shall describe in this book is transitional. I'm not a primitivist who advocates the abandonment of civilization, of technology and culture, of the gifts that make us human. I foresee rather the restoration of humanity to a sacred estate, bearing all the wholeness and harmony with nature of the hunter-gatherer time, but at a higher level of organization. I foresee the fulfillment, and not the abdication, of the gifts of hand and mind that make us human. Notice how natural it is to describe our uniquely human attributes as gifts. In keeping with the gifts' universal principles, our human gifts partake of their giver as well. In other words, they are divine gifts. Mythology bears this intuition out, from the Promethean gift of fire to the Apollonian gift of music, to the gift of agriculture from the Chinese mythological ruler Shennan. In the Bible, too, we are given not only the world, but the breath of life and our capacity to create, for we are made in the image of the Creator itself. On the personal level as well, we all sense that our individual gifts were given to us for a reason, a purpose. Moreover, we have an irrepressible desire to develop those gifts, and from them, to give our own gifts out into the world. Everyone has experienced the joy of giving and the selfless generosity of strangers. Ask for directions in a city, and most people are pleased to take time to help. It is in no one's rational self-interest to give directions to a stranger. This is a simple expression of our innate generosity. It is ironic indeed that money, originally a means of connecting gifts with needs, originally an outgrowth of a sacred gift economy, is now precisely what blocks the blossoming of our desire to give, keeping us in deadening jobs out of economic necessity, and forestalling our most generous impulses with the words, "I can't afford to do that." We live in an omnipresent anxiety, born of the scarcity of the money which we depend on for life. Witness the phrase, "the cost of living." Our purpose for being, the development and full expression of our gifts, is mortgaged to the demands of money, to making a living, to surviving. Yet no one, no matter how wealthy, secure, or comfortable, can ever feel fulfilled in a life where those gifts remain latent. Even the best paid job, if it does not engage our gifts, soon feels deadening, and we think, "I was not put here on earth to do this." Even when a job does engage our gifts, if the purpose is something we don't believe in, the same deadening feeling of futility arises again, the feeling that we are not living our own lives, but only the lives we are paid to live. Challenging and interesting are not good enough, because our gifts are sacred, and therefore meant for a sacred purpose. That we are indeed here on earth to do something is essentially a religious concept, for conventional biology teaches that we have evolved to be able to survive, that any effort towards something outside of survival and reproduction goes against our genetic programming. However, one can make a cogent neo-Lamarckian case that the view of biology as consisting of myriad discrete, separate competing selves, organisms or selfish genes is more a projection of our own present-day culture than it is an accurate understanding of nature. There are other ways of understanding nature that, while not ignoring its obvious competition, give primacy to cooperation, symbiosis, and the merging of organisms into larger wholes. This new understanding is actually quite ancient, echoing the indigenous understanding of nature as a web of gifts. Each organism and each species makes a vital contribution to the totality of life on Earth, and this contribution, contrary to the expectations of standard evolutionary biology, need not have any direct benefit for the organism itself. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria don't directly benefit from doing so, except that the nitrogen they give to the soil grows plants that grow roots that grow fungi, which ultimately provide nutrients to the bacteria. Pioneer species pave the way for keystone species, which provide microniches for other species, which feed yet other species in a web of gifts that, eventually, circle back to benefit the pioneer species. Trees bring up water to water other plants, and algae make oxygen so that animals can breathe. Remove any being, and the health of all becomes more precarious. You may think me naive, with my so that reasoning. You may say it is just good luck that things work out so well. The trees don't care about watering the plants around them. They are in it for themselves, maximizing their chances to survive and reproduce. That they nourish other beings is an unintended side effect. The same from the algae, for the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and for the bacteria inside ruminants that allow them to digest cellulose. This world, you might think, is everyone for himself. Nature is a cutthroat competition, and an economy that is the same is natural too. I do not think it is natural. It is an aberration, a peculiar though necessary phase that has reached its extreme and is now giving way to a new one. In nature, headlong growth and all-out competition are features of immature ecosystems, followed by complex interdependency, symbiosis, cooperation, and the cycling of resources. The next stage of human economy will parallel what we are beginning to understand about nature. It will call forth the gifts of each of us, it will emphasize cooperation over competition, it will encourage circulation over hoarding, and it will be cyclical, not linear. Money may not disappear anytime soon, but it will serve a diminished role even as it takes on more of the properties of the gift. The economy will shrink, and our lives will grow. Money as we know it is inimical to an economy manifesting the spirit of the gift, an economy we might call sacred. In order to know what kind of money could be a sacred currency, it will help to identify exactly what makes money into the force for greed, evil, scarcity, and environmental pillage that it is today. Just as science often projects culture onto nature, so economics takes culturally determined conditions as axiomatic. Living in a culture of scarcity, for scarcity is what we are experiencing, when making a living dictates the expression of our gifts, we assume it as the basis of economics. As in biology, we have seen the world as a competition among separate selves for limited resources. Our money system, as we shall see, embodies this belief on a deep, structural level. But is this belief true? Do we live in a world, a universe, of basic scarcity? And if not, if the true nature of the universe is abundance and the gift, then how did money become so unnatural? Chapter 2. The Illusion of Scarcity. With unabated bounty the land of England blooms and grows, waving with yellow harvests, thick-studded with workshops, industrial implements, with 15 millions of workers, understood to be the strongest, the cunningest and the willingest our earth ever had. These men are here, the work they have done, the fruit they have realized is here, abundant, exuberant on every hand of us, and behold, some baleful fiat as of enchantment has gone forth, saying, touch it not, ye workers, ye master workers, ye master idlers, none of you can touch it, no man of you shall be the better for it, this is enchanted fruit. Thomas Carlyle, Past and Present. It is said that money, or at least the love of it, is the root of all evil. But why should it be? After all, the purpose of money is, at its most basic, simply to facilitate exchange, in other words, to connect human gifts with human needs. What power, what monstrous perversion, has turned money into the opposite, an agent of scarcity? Question. For indeed we live in a world of fundamental abundance, a world where vast quantities of food, energy, and materials go to waste. Half the world starves while the other half wastes enough to feed the first half. In the third world and our own ghettos, people lack food, shelter, and other basic necessities and cannot afford to buy them. Meanwhile, we pour vast resources into wars, plastic junk, and innumerable other products that do not serve human happiness. Obviously, poverty is not due to a lack of productive capacity. Nor is it due to a lack of willingness to help. Many people would love to feed the poor, to restore nature, and do other meaningful work but cannot because there is no money in it. Money utterly fails to connect gifts and needs. Why? For years, following conventional opinion, I thought the answer was greed. Why do sweatshop factories push wages down to the bare minimum? Greed. Why do people buy gas-guzzling SUVs? Greed. Why do pharmaceutical companies suppress research and sell drugs that they know are dangerous? Greed. Why do tropical fish supply us dynamite coral reefs? Why do factories pump toxic waste into the rivers? Why do corporate traders loot employee pension funds? Greed, greed, greed. Eventually I became uncomfortable with that answer. For one thing, It plays into the same ideology of separation that lies at the root of our civilization's ills. It is an ideology as old as agriculture's division of the world into two separate realms, the wild and the domestic, the human and the natural, the wheat and the weed. It says there are two opposing forces in this world, good and evil, and that we can create a better world by eliminating evil. There is something bad in the world and something bad in ourselves, something we must extirpate to make the world safe for goodness. The war against evil imbues every institution of our society. In agriculture, it appears as the desire to exterminate wolves, to destroy all weeds with glyphosate, to kill all the pests. In medicine it is the war against germs, a constant battle against a hostile world. In religion it is the struggle against sin, or against ego, or against faithlessness or doubt, or against the outward projection of these things, the devil, the infidel. It is the mentality of purifying and purging, of self-improvement and conquest, of rising above nature and transcending desire, of sacrificing oneself in order to be good. Above all, it is the mentality of control. It says that once final victory over evil is won, we will enter paradise. When we eliminate all the terrorists or create an impenetrable barrier to them, we will be safe. When we develop an irresistible antibiotic and artificial regulation of body processes, we will have perfect health. When we make crime impossible and have a law to govern everything, we will have a perfect society. When you overcome your laziness, your compulsions, your addictions, you will have a perfect life. Until then, you are just going to have to try harder. In the same vein, the problem in economic life is supposedly greed, both outside ourselves in the form of all those greedy people and within ourselves in the form of our own greedy tendencies. We like to imagine that we ourselves are not so greedy. Maybe we have greedy impulses, but we keep them under control. Unlike some people don't keep their greed in check. They are lacking in something fundamental that you and I have, some basic decency, basic goodness. They are, in a word, bad. If they can't learn to restrain their desires, to make do with less, then we'll have to force them to. Clearly, the paradigm of greed is rife with judgment of others, and with self-judgment as well. Our self-righteous anger and hatred of the greedy harbor the secret fear that we are no better than they are. It is the hypocrite who is the most zealous in the persecution of evil. Externalizing the enemy gives expression to unresolved feelings of anger. In a way, this is a necessity. The consequences of keeping them bottled up or directed inward are horrific. But there came a time in my life when I was through hating, through with the war against the self, through with the struggle to be good, and through with the pretense that I was any better than anyone else. I believe humanity, collectively, is nearing such a time as well. Ultimately, greed is a red herring, itself a symptom and not a cause of a deeper problem. To blame greed and to fight it by intensifying the program of self-control is to intensify the war against the self, which is just another expression of the war against nature and the war against the other that lies at the base of the present crisis of civilization. Greed makes sense in a context of scarcity. Our reigning ideology assumes it is built into our story of self. The separate self in a universe governed by hostile or indifferent forces is always at the edge of extinction, and secure only to the extent that it can control these forces. Cast into an objective universe external to ourselves, we must compete with each other for limited resources. Based on the story of the separate self, both biology and economics have therefore written greed into their basic axioms. In biology it is the gene seeking to maximize reproductive self-interest. In economics it is the rational actor seeking to maximize financial self-interest. But what if the assumption of scarcity is false, a projection of our ideology, and not the ultimate reality? If so, then greed is not written into our biology but is a mere symptom of the perception of scarcity. An indication that greed reflects the perception rather than the reality of scarcity is that rich people tend to be less generous than poor people. In my experience, poor people quite often lend or give each other small sums that, proportionally speaking, would be the equivalent of half a rich person's net worth. Extensive research backs up this observation. A large 2002 survey by Independent Sector, a non-profit research organization, found that Americans making less than $25,000 gave 4.2% of their income to charity, as opposed to 2.7% for people making over $100,000. More recently, Paul Biff, a social psychologist at University of California, Berkeley, found that lower-income people were more generous, charitable, trusting and helpful to others than were those with more wealth. Piff found that when research subjects were given money to anonymously distribute between themselves and a partner, who would never know their identity, their generosity correlated inversely to their socio-economic status. While it is tempting to conclude from this that greedy people become wealthy, an equally plausible interpretation is that wealth makes people greedy. Why would this be? In a context of abundance, greed is silly. Only in a context of scarcity is it rational. The wealthy perceive scarcity where there is none. They also worry more than anybody else about money. Could it be that money itself causes the perception of scarcity? Could it be that money, nearly synonymous with security, ironically brings the opposite? The answer to both these questions is yes. On the individual level, rich people have a lot more invested in their money and are less able to let go of it. To let go easily reflects an attitude of abundance. On the systemic level, as we shall see, scarcity is also built into money, a direct result of the way it is created and circulated. The assumption of scarcity is one of the two central axioms of economics. The second is that people naturally seek to maximize their rational self-interest. Both are false, or, more precisely, they are true only within a narrow realm, a realm that we, the frog at the bottom of the well, mistake for the whole of reality. As is so often the case, what we take to be objective truth is actually a projection of our own condition onto the objective world. So immersed in scarcity are we that we take it to be the nature of reality. But in fact, we live in a world of abundance. The omnipresent scarcity we experience is an artifact of our money system, of our politics, and of our perceptions. As we shall see, our money system, system of ownership, and general economic system reflect the same fundamental sense of self that has, built into it, the perception of scarcity. It is the discrete and separate self, the Cartesian self, a bubble of psychology marooned in an indifferent universe, seeking to own, to control, to arrogate as much wealth to itself as possible, but foredoomed by its very cut-off from the richness of connected beingness to the experience of never having enough. The assertion that we live in a world of abundance sometimes provokes an emotional reaction, bordering on hostility, in those of my readers who believe that harmonious human coexistence with the rest of life is impossible without a massive reduction in population. They cite peak oil and resource depletion, global warming, the exhaustion of our farmland, and our ecological footprint as evidence that the Earth cannot long support industrial civilization at present population levels. This book offers a response to this concern as part of a vision of a sacred economy. More importantly, it addresses the how questions as well, for example, how we will get to the from here. For now I will offer a partial response, a reason for hope. It is true that human activity is vastly overburdening the Earth today. Fossil fuels, aquifers, topsoil, the capacity to absorb pollution, and the ecosystems that maintain the viability of the biosphere are all being depleted at an alarming rate. All the measures on the table are far too little, far too late, a drop in the bucket compared to what is needed. On the other hand, an enormous proportion of this human activity is either superfluous or deleterious to human happiness. Consider first the armaments industry and the resources consumed in war, some $2 trillion a year, a vast scientific establishment, and the life energy of millions of young people, all to serve no need except one we create ourselves. Consider the housing industry here in the United States, with the enormous McMansions of the last 2 decades that again serve no real human need. In some countries a building that size would house 50 people. As it is, the cavernous living rooms go unused, for people feel uncomfortable in their inhuman scale and seek out the comfort of the small den and the breakfast nook. The materials, energy, and maintenance of such monstrosities are a waste of resources. Perhaps even more wasteful is the layout of suburbia, which makes public transportation impossible and necessitates inordinate amounts of driving. Consider the food industry, which exhibits massive waste at every level. According to a government study, farm-to-retail losses are about 4%, retail-to-consumer losses 12%, and consumer-level losses 29%. Moreover, vast tracts of farmland are devoted to biofuel production, and mechanized agriculture precludes labor-intensive intercropping and other intensive production techniques that could vastly increase productivity. Such figures suggest the potential plenty available even in a world of 7 billion people, but with a caveat: people will spend much more time, per capita, growing food, in a reversal of the trend of the last 2 centuries. Few realize that organic agriculture can be 2 to 3 times more productive than conventional agriculture per hectare, not per hour of labor. And intensive gardening can be more productive, and more labor-intensive, still. If you like gardening and think that most people would benefit from being closer to the soil, this is good news. With a few hours work a week, a typical suburban garden plot of perhaps 1,000 square feet can meet most of a family's vegetable needs, double that, and it can provide substantial amounts of staples too, like potatoes, sweet potatoes, and squash. Is the vast transcontinental trucking system that brings California lettuce and carrots to the rest of the country really necessary? Does it enhance life in any way? Another type of waste comes from the shoddy construction and planned obsolescence of many of our manufactured goods. Presently there are few economic incentives, and some disincentives, to produce goods that last a long time and are easy to fix, with the absurd result that it is often cheaper to buy a new appliance than to repair an old one. This is ultimately a consequence of our money system, and it will be reversed in a sacred economy. On my street, every family possesses a lawnmower that is used perhaps 10 hours per summer. Each kitchen has a blender that is used at most 15 minutes per week. At any given moment, about half the cars are parked on the street, doing nothing. Most families have their own hedge clippers, their own power tools, their own exercise equipment. Because they are unused most of the time, most of these things are superfluous. Our quality of life would be just as high with half the number of cars, a tenth of the lawnmowers, and 2 or 3 stairmasters for the whole street. In fact, it would be higher since we would have occasion to interact and share. Even at our current, gratuitously high rate of consumption, some 40% of the world's industrial capacity stands idle. That figure could be increased to 80% or more without any loss of human happiness. All we would lose would be the pollution and tedium of a lot of factory production. Of course, we would lose a vast number of jobs as well, but since these are not contributing much to human well-being anyway, we could employ those people digging holes in the ground and filling them up again with no loss. Or, better, we could devote them to labor-intensive roles like permaculture, care for the sick and elderly, restoration of ecosystems, and all the other needs of today that go tragically unmet for lack of money. A world without weapons, without McMansions in sprawling suburbs, without mountains of unnecessary packaging, without giant mechanized monofarms, without energy-hogging big-box stores, without electronic billboards, without endless piles of throwaway junk, without the overconsumption of consumer goods no one really needs is not an impoverished world. I disagree with those environmentalists who say we are going to have to make do with less. In fact, we are going to make do with more beauty, more community, more fulfillment, more art, more music, and material objects that are fewer in number but superior in utility and aesthetics. The cheap stuff that fills our lives today, however great its quantity, can only cheapen life. Part of the healing that a sacred economy represents is the healing of the divide we have created between spirit and matter. In keeping with the sacredness of all things, I advocate an embrace, not an eschewing, of materialism. I think we will love our things more and not less. We will treasure our material possessions, honor where they came from and where they will go. If you have a treasured baseball mitt or fishing rod, you may know what I'm talking about. Or perhaps your grandfather had a favorite set of woodworking tools that he kept in perfect condition for 50 years. That is how we will honor our things. Can you imagine what the world would be like if that same care and consideration went into everything we produced? If every engineer put that much love into her creations? Today, such an attitude is uneconomic. It is rarely in anyone's financial interest to treat a thing as sacred. You can just buy a new baseball mitt or fishing rod, and why be too careful with your tools when new ones are so cheap? The cheapness of our things is part of their devaluation, casting us into a cheap world where everything is generic and expendable. Amidst superabundance, even we in rich countries live in an omnipresent anxiety, craving financial security as we try to keep scarcity at bay. We make choices, even those having nothing to do with money, according to what we can afford, and we commonly associate freedom with wealth. But when we pursue it, we find that the paradise of financial freedom is a mirage, receding as we approach it, and that the chase itself enslaves. The anxiety is always there, the scarcity always just one disaster away. We call that chase greed. Truly, it is a response to the perception of scarcity. Let me offer one more kind of evidence, for now meant to be suggestive rather than conclusive, for the artificiality or illusory nature of the scarcity we experience. Economics, it says on page 1 of textbooks, is the study of human behavior under conditions of scarcity. The expansion of the economic realm is therefore the expansion of scarcity, its incursion into areas of life once characterized by abundance. Economic behavior, particularly the exchange of money for goods, extends today into realms that were never before the subject of money exchanges. Take, for example, one of the great retail growth categories in the last decade, bottled water. If one thing is abundant on Earth to the point of near ubiquity, it is water, yet today it has become scarce, something we pay for. Childcare has been another area of high economic growth in my lifetime. When I was young, it was nothing for friends and neighbors to watch each other's kids for a few hours after school, a vestige of village or tribal times when children ran free. My ex-wife Patsy speaks movingly of her childhood in rural Taiwan, where children could and did show up at any neighbor's house around dinner time to be given a bowl of rice. The community took care of the children. In other words, child care was abundant. It would have been impossible to open an after-school daycare center. For something to become an object of commerce, it must be made scarce first. As the economy grows, by definition, more and more of human activity enters the realm of money, the realm of goods and services. Usually we associate economic growth with an increase in wealth, but we can also see it as an impoverishment, an increase in scarcity. Things we once never dreamed of paying for, we must pay for today. Pay for using what? Using money. Of course, money that we struggle and sacrifice to obtain. If one thing is scarce, it is surely money. Most people I know live in constant low-level, sometimes high-level, anxiety for fear of not having enough of it. And as the anxiety of the wealthy confirms, no amount is ever enough. From this perspective, we must be cautious in our indignation at such facts as, over 2 billion people live on less than $2 a day. A low cash income could mean that someone's needs are met outside the money economy, for example through traditional networks of reciprocity and gifts. Development in such cases raises incomes by bringing non-monetary economic activity into the realm of goods and services, with the resulting mentality of scarcity, competition, and anxiety so familiar to us in the West, yet so alien to the moneyless hunter-gatherer or subsistence peasant. Ensuing chapters explain the mechanisms and meaning of the centuries-old conversion of life and the world into money, the progressive commodification of everything. When everything is subject to money, then the scarcity of money makes everything scarce, including the basis of human life and happiness. Such is the life of the slave, one whose actions are compelled by threat to survival. Perhaps the deepest indication of our slavery is the monetization of time. It is a phenomenon with roots deeper than our money system, for it depends on the prior quantification of time. An animal or a child has all the time in the world. The same was apparently true for Stone Age peoples, who usually had very loose concepts of time and rarely were in a hurry. Primitive languages often lacked tenses, and sometimes lacked even words for yesterday or tomorrow. The comparative nonchalance primitive people had toward time is still apparent today in rural, more traditional parts of the world. Life moves faster in the big city, where we are always in a hurry because time is scarce. But in the past, we experienced time as abundant. The more monetized society is, the more anxious and hurried its citizens. In parts of the world that are still somewhat outside the money economy, where subsistence farming still exists and where neighbors help each other, the pace of life is slower, less hurried. In rural Mexico, everything is done ma'ana. A Ladakhi peasant woman interviewed in Helena Norberg Hodges' film Ancient Futures sums it all up in describing her city-dwelling sister. She has a rice cooker, a car, a telephone, all kinds of time-saving devices. Yet when I visit her, she is always so busy we barely have time to talk. For the animal, child, or hunter-gatherer, time is essentially infinite. Today its monetization has subjected it, like the rest, to scarcity. Time is life. When we experience time as scarce, we experience life as short and poor. If you were born before adult schedules invaded childhood and children were rushed around from activity to activity, then perhaps you still remember the subjective eternity of childhood, the afternoons that stretched on forever, the timeless freedom of life before the tyranny of calendar and clocks. Clocks, writes John Zerzan, make time scarce and life short. Once quantified, time too could be bought and sold, and the scarcity of all money-linked commodities afflicted time as well. Time is money, the saying goes, an identity confirmed by the metaphor I can't afford the time. If the material world is fundamentally an abundant world, all the more abundant is the spiritual world, the creations of the human mind, songs, stories, films, ideas, and everything else that goes by the name of intellectual property. Because in the digital age we can replicate and spread them at virtually no cost, artificial scarcity must be imposed upon them in order to keep them in the monetized realm. Industry and the government enforce scarcity through copyrights, patents, and encryption standards, allowing the holders of such property to profit from owning it. Scarcity, then, is mostly an illusion, a cultural creation. But because we live, almost wholly, in a culturally constructed world, our experience of this scarcity is quite real enough that nearly 1 billion people today are malnourished, and some 5,000 children die each day from hunger-related causes. So our responses to this scarcity, anxiety and greed are perfectly understandable. When something is abundant, no one hesitates to share it. We live in an abundant world, made otherwise through our perceptions, our culture, and our deep invisible stories. Our perception of scarcity is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Money is central to the construction of the self-reifying illusion of scarcity. Money, which has turned abundance into scarcity, engenders greed. But not money per se, only the kind of money we use today, money that embodies our cultural sense of self, our unconscious myths, and an adversarial relationship with nature thousands of years in the making. All of these things are changing today. Let us look, then, at how money came to so afflict our minds and ways, so that we might envision how the money system might change with them. Chapter 3. Money and the Mind. When all are isolated by egoism, there is nothing but dust, and at the advent of a storm, nothing but mire. Benjamin Constant. The power to induce a collective hallucination of scarcity is only one of the ways money affects our perceptions. This chapter will explore some of the deep psychological and spiritual effects of money, on the way we see the world, on our religion, our philosophy, even our science. Money is woven into our minds, our perceptions, our identities. That is why, when a crisis of money strikes, it seems that the fabric of reality is unraveling, to that the very world is falling apart. Yet this is also cause for great optimism, because money is a social construction that we have the power to change. What new kinds of perceptions, and what new kinds of collective actions, would accompany a new kind of money? Here we are on chapter 3, and I have not even defined money yet. Most economists define money by its functions, such as medium of exchange, unit of account, and store of value. Accordingly, they put a very early date on the origin of money, perhaps 5,000 years ago, with the emergence of standard commodities such as grain, oil, cattle, or gold that served these functions. But when I speak of money, I am talking about something quite different, something that first appeared in Greece in the 7th century BC. That was arguably the first time that money transcended mere commodity to become a distinct category of being. Henceforward, we could speak not only of what money does, but also of what it is. Economists' folklore holds that coins were invented in order to provide a guarantee of weight and purity for the underlying commodity metal. Their value, this story goes, came entirely from the gold or silver from which they were made. In fact, like the barter origin of money, like the assumption of scarcity, this account of the origin of coinage is an economist's fantasy. It is a fantasy with an illustrious lineage, to be sure. Aristotle wrote, "For the various necessaries of life are not easily carried about, and hence men agreed to employ in their dealings with each other something which was intrinsically useful and easily applicable to the purposes of life, for example, iron, silver, and the like. Of this the value was at first measured simply by size and weight, but in process of time they put a stamp upon it, to save the trouble of weighing and to mark the value." This account seems quite reasonable, but historical evidence seems to contradict it. The very first coins, minted in Lydia, were made of electrum, a silver-gold alloy, that varied widely in consistency. Coinage quickly spread to Greece, where, even though coins were fairly consistent in weight and purity, they often had a value greater than the commodity value of the silver from which they were minted. Indeed, some city-states, including Sparta, minted coins from base metals like iron, bronze, lead, or tin. Such coins had negligible intrinsic value but still functioned as money. In either case, stamped coins had a value, which, following historian Richard Seaford, we shall call the fiduciary value, greater than an identical but unstamped disc of metal. Why? What was this mysterious power that inhered in a mere sign? It was not a guarantee of weight and purity, nor was it an extension of the personal power of a ruler or religious authority. Seaford observes, whereas seal marks seem to embody the power of the owner of the seal, coin marks create no imagined attachment between the coins and their source. Rather, coin marks authenticate the metal as possessing a certain value. And they do so not by transmitting power, magical or otherwise, to the piece of metal, but by imposing on it a form that recognizably assigns it to a distinct category of things, the category of authentic coins. The coin mark operates in effect as a mere sign. Signs have no intrinsic power, but derive it from human interpretation. To the extent a society holds such interpretations in common, signs or symbols bear social power. The new kind of money that emerged in ancient Greece derived its value from a social agreement, of which the marks on coins were tokens. This agreement is the essence of money. This should be obvious today, when most money is electronic and the rest has the approximate intrinsic value of a sheet of toilet paper. But money has been an agreement ever since the days of the ancient Greeks. Those reformers who advocate gold coinage as a way to return to the good old days of real money are trying to return to something that never existed, except perhaps for brief historical moments, almost as an ideal. I believe that the next step in the evolution of human money will be not a return to an earlier form of currency, but its transformation from an unconscious to an intentional embodiment of our agreements. Over 5,000 years, money has evolved from pure commodity, to a symbol riding upon a material, to pure symbol today. Sacred economics seeks not to undo this evolution, but to fulfill it. The agreement that is money does not stand in isolation from the other systems of signs and symbols by which our civilization operates. We can embody in our money new agreements about the planet, the species, and what we hold sacred. For a long time we held progress sacred, the advancement of science and technology, the conquest of the natural realm. Our money system supported those goals. Our goals are changing now, and with them the great meta-stories of which the agreement called money is a part, the story of self, the story of the people, and the story of the world. The purpose of this book is to tell a new story of money, to illuminate what new agreements we might embody within these fiduciary talismans, so that money is the ally, and not the enemy, of the more beautiful world our hearts tell us is possible. It is no accident that ancient Greece, the place where symbolic money originated, also gave birth to the modern conception of the individual, to the notions of logic and reason, and to the philosophical underpinnings of the modern mind. In his scholarly masterpiece Money and the Ancient Greek Mind, classics Professor Richard Seaford explores the impact of money on Greek society and thought, illuminating the characteristics that make money unique. Among them are that it is both concrete and abstract, that it is homogeneous, impersonal, a universal aim, and a universal means, and that it is unlimited. The entrance of this new, unique power into the world had profound consequences, many of which are now so deeply woven into our beliefs and culture, psyche and society, that we can barely perceive them, let alone question them. Money is homogeneous in that regardless of any physical differences among coins qua money are identical, if they are of the same denomination. New or old, worn or smooth, all 1 drachma coins are equal. This was something new in the 6th century BC. Whereas in archaic times, Seaford observes, power was conferred by unique talismanic objects, for example a scepter said to be handed down from Zeus. Money is the opposite. Its power is conferred by a standard sign that wipes out variations in purity and weight. Quality is not important, only quantity. Because money is convertible into all other things, it infects them with the same feature, turning them into commodities, objects that, as long as they meet certain criteria, are seen as identical. All that matters is how many or how much. Money, says Seaford, promotes a sense of homogeneity among things in general. All things are equal, because they can be sold for money, which can in turn be used to buy any other thing. In the commodity world, things are equal to the money that can replace them. Their primary attribute is their value and abstraction. I feel a distancing, a letdown, in the phrase, "You can always buy another one." Can you see how this promotes an anti-materialism, a detachment from the physical world in which each person, place, and thing is special, unique? No wonder Greek philosophers of this era began elevating the abstract over the real, culminating in Plato's invention of a world of perfect forms more real than the world of the senses. No wonder to this day we treat the physical world so cavalierly. No wonder, after 2,000 years immersion in the mentality of money, we have become so used to the replaceability of all things that we behave as if we could, if we wrecked the planet, simply buy a new one. I named this chapter Money and the Mind. Very much like the fiduciary value of money, mind is an abstraction riding a physical vehicle. Like monetary fiduciarity, the idea of mind as a separate, non-material essence of being developed over thousands of years, leading to the modern concept of an immaterial consciousness, a disembodied spirit. Tellingly, in both secular and religious thought, this abstraction has become more important than the physical vehicle, just as the value of a thing is more important than its physical attributes. In the introduction I mentioned the idea that we have created a God in the image of our money, an unseen force that moves all things, that animates the world, an invisible hand that orders human activity, non-material yet ubiquitous. Many of these attributes of God or spirit go back to the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers who developed their ideas at precisely the time that money took over their society. According to Seifert, they were the first to even distinguish between essence and appearance, between the concrete and the abstract, a distinction completely absent, even implicitly, from Homer. From Anaximander's Aper and to Heraclitus' Logos to the Pythagorean doctrine all is number, the early Greeks emphasized the primacy of the abstract, an unseen principle that orders the world. This ideology has infiltrated the DNA of our civilization to the point where the size of the financial sector dwarfs the real economy, where the total value of financial derivatives is 10 times the world's gross domestic product, where the greatest rewards of our society go to the Wall Street wizards who do nothing but manipulate symbols. For the trader at his computer, it is indeed as Pythagoras said, all is number. One manifestation of this spirit-matter split that gives primacy to the former is the idea, sure, economic reform is a worthy cause, but what is much more important is a transformation of human consciousness. I think this view is mistaken, for it is based on a false dichotomy of consciousness and action, and ultimately of spirit and matter. On a deep level, money and consciousness are intertwined. Each is bound up in the other. The development of monetary abstraction fits into a vast meta-historical context. Money could not have developed without a foundation of abstraction in the form of words and numbers. Already, number and label distance us from the real world and prime our minds to think abstractly. To use a noun already implies an identity among the many things so named. To say there are 5 of a thing makes each a unit. We begin to think of objects as representatives of a category, and not unique beings in themselves. So, while standard, generic categories didn't begin with money, money vastly accelerated their conceptual dominance. Moreover, the homogeneity of money accompanied the rapid development of standardized commodity goods for trade. Such standardization was crude in pre-industrial times, but today manufactured objects are so nearly identical as to make the lie of money into the truth. As we consider the form of the money of the future, let us keep in mind money's power to homogenize all that it touches. Perhaps money should only be used for that which is or should be standard, quantifiable, or generic. Perhaps a different kind of money, or no money at all, should be involved in the circulation of those things that are personal and unique. We can only compare prices based on standard quantities. Thus, when we receive more than that, something immeasurable, we have received a bonus, something we didn't pay for. In other words, we have received a gift. To be sure, we can buy art, but we sense that if it is mere commodity, we pay too much, and if it is true art, we pay infinitely too little. Similarly, we can buy sex but not love, we can buy calories but not real nourishment. Today we suffer a poverty of immeasurable things, priceless things, a poverty of the things that money cannot buy and a surfeit of the things it can, though this surfeit is so unequally distributed that many suffer a poverty of those things, too. Just as money homogenizes the things it touches, so also does it homogenize and depersonalize its users. It facilitates the kind of commercial exchange that is disembedded from all other relations. In other words, people become mere parties to a transaction. In contrast to the diverse motivations that characterize the giving and receiving of gifts, in a pure financial transaction we are all identical, we all want to get the best deal. This homogeneity among human beings that is an effect of money is assumed by economics to be a cause. The whole story of money's evolution from barter assumes that it is fundamental human nature to want to maximize self-interest. In this, human beings are assumed to be identical. When there is no standard of value, different humans want different things. When money is exchangeable for anything, then all people want the same thing, money. Seifert writes, stripped of all personal association, money is promiscuous, capable of being exchanged with anybody for anything, indifferent to all non-monetary interpersonal relationships. Unlike other objects, money retains no trace of its origins and no trace of those through whom it has passed. Whereas a gift seems to partake of its giver, everyone's money is the same. If I have $2,000 in the bank, half from my friend and half from my enemy, I cannot choose to spend my enemy's $1,000 first and save my friend's. Each dollar is identical. Wisely, perhaps, many people refuse on principle to mix business with friendship, wary of the essential conflict between money and personal relationship. Money depersonalizes a relationship, turning two people into mere parties to an exchange driven by the universal goal of maximizing self-interest. If I seek to maximize self-interest, perhaps at your expense, how can we be friends? And when in our highly monetized society we meet nearly all our needs with money, what personal gifts remain from which to build friendship? That the profit motive is antithetical to any benignant personal motive is nearly axiomatic, hence the phrase, "Don't take it personally, it's just business." Today, an ethical business movement and ethical investment movement seek to heal the opposition between love and profit, but however sincere the motives, such efforts often mutate into public relations, greenwashing, or self-righteousness. This is no accident. In later chapters I will describe a fatal contradiction in the attempt to invest ethically, but for now just note your natural suspicion of it, and in general of any claim to do well by doing good. Any time we come across a seemingly altruistic enterprise, we tend to think, what's the catch? How are they secretly making money from this? When are they going to ask me for money? The suspicion, he's actually doing it for the money, is nearly universal. We are quick to descry financial motives in everything people do, and we are deeply moved when someone does something so magnanimous or so naively generous that such motive is obviously absent. It seems irrational, even miraculous, that someone would actually give without contrivance of return. As Lewis Hyde puts it, in The Empires of Usury, the sentimentality of the man with the soft heart calls to us because it speaks of what has been lost. The near universality of the suspicion of an ulterior profit motive reflects money as a universal aim. Imagine yourself back in school, speaking to the career counselor, discussing what your gifts are and how you might use them to make a living, that is to convert them into money. This habit of thought runs deep. When my teenage son Jimmy shows me the computer games he makes, I sometimes find myself thinking about how he might commercialize them and about which programming skills he could develop next to be more marketable. Almost any time someone gets an exciting creative idea, the thought, how can we make money from this, follows close behind. But when profit becomes the aim, and not a mere side effect, of artistic creation, the creation ceases to be art, and we become sellouts. Expanding this principle to life in general, Robert Graves warns, you choose your jobs to provide you with a steady income and leisure to render the goddess whom you adore valuable part-time service. Who am I, you will ask, to warn you that she demands either whole-time service or none at all? Money as a universal aim is embedded in our language. We speak of capitalizing on our ideas and use gratuitous, which literally means received with thanks, and not payment, as a synonym for unnecessary. It is embedded in economics, to be sure, in the assumption that human beings seek to maximize a self-interest that is equivalent to money. It is even embedded in science, where it is a cipher for reproductive self-interest. Here, too, the notion of a universal aim has taken hold. That there is even such a thing as a universal aim to life, be it money or something else, is not at all obvious. This idea apparently arose at about the same time money did. Perhaps it was money that suggested it to philosophers. Socrates used a money metaphor explicitly in proposing intelligence as universal aim. There is only one right currency for which we ought to exchange all these other things, pleasures and pains, intelligence. In religion this corresponds to the pursuit of an ultimate aim, such as salvation or enlightenment, from which all other good things flow. How like the unlimited aim of money. I wonder what the effect would be on our spirituality if we gave up on the pursuit of a unitary, abstract goal that we believe to be the key to everything else. How would it feel to release the endless campaign to improve ourselves, to make progress toward a goal? What would it be like just to play instead, just to be? Like wealth, Enlightenment is a goal that knows no limit, and in both cases the pursuit of it can enslave. In both cases, I think that the object of the pursuit is a spurious substitute for a diversity of things that people really want. In a fully monetized society, in which nearly everything is a good or a service, money converts the multiplicity of the world into a unity, a single thing that is the measure of, and exchangeable with, almost anything else. The Apean, the Logos, and similar conceptions were all versions of an underlying unity that gives birth to all things. It is that from which all things arise and to which all things return. As such it is nearly identical with the ancient Chinese conception of the Tao, which gives birth to yin and yang, and then to the 10,000 things. Interestingly, the semi-legendary preceptor of Taoism, Lao Tzu, lived at approximately the same time as the pre-Socratic philosophers, which is also more or less the time of the first Chinese coinage. In any event, today it is still money that gives birth to the 10,000 things. Whatever you want to build in this world, you start with an investment, with money. And then, when you have finished your project, it is time to sell it. All things come from money, all things return to money. Money is therefore not only a universal aim, it is a universal means as well, and indeed it is largely because it is a universal means that it is also a universal end, of which one can never have too much. Or at least, that is how we perceive it. Many times I've been witness to discussions about creating an intentional community or launching some other project, only for it to end with a disheartening admission that it will never happen because, where are we going to get the money? Money is quite understandably seen as the crucial factor in determining what we can create. After all, it can buy virtually any good, can induce people to perform virtually any service. Everything has its price. Money can even, it seems, purchase intangibles such as social status, political power, and divine goodwill, or if not that, at least the favor of religious authorities, which is the next best thing. We are quite accustomed to seeing money as the key to the fulfillment of all our desires. How many dreams do you have that you assume you could fulfill if only, and only if, you had the money? Thus we mortgage our dreams to money, turning it from means to end. I will not advocate the abolition of money. Money has exceeded its proper bounds, become the means to attain things that should never be infected by its homogeneity and depersonalization. Meanwhile, as we have universalized it as means, those things that money truly cannot buy have become unattainable, and no matter how much money we have, we can obtain only their semblance. The solution is to restore money to its proper role. For indeed there are things that human beings can create only with money, or with some equivalent means of coordinating human activity on a mass scale. In its sacred form, money is the implement of a story, an embodied agreement that assigns roles and focuses intention. I will return to this theme later as I describe what money might look like in a sacred economy. Because there is no apparent limit to what money can buy, our desire for money tends to be unlimited as well. The limitless desire for money was abundantly apparent to the ancient Greeks. At the very beginning of the money era, the great poet and reformer Solon observed, "Of wealth, there is no limit that appears to man, for those of us who have the most wealth are eager to double it." Aristophanes wrote that money is unique because in all other things, such as bread, sex, etc. there is satiety, but not of money. How much is enough? A friend once asked of a billionaire he knew. The billionaire was stumped. The reason that no amount of money can ever be enough is that we use it to fulfill needs that money cannot actually fulfill. As such it is like any other addictive substance, temporarily dulling the pain of an unmet need while leaving the need unmet. Increasing doses are required to dull the pain, but no amount can ever be enough. Today people use money as a substitute for connection, for excitement, for self-respect, for freedom, and for much else. If only I had $1 million, then I'd be free. How many talented people sacrifice their youth hoping for an early retirement to a life of freedom, only to find themselves, at midlife, enslaved to their money. When the primary function of money is as a medium of exchange, it is subject to the same limits as the goods for which it is exchanged. and our desire for it is limited by our satiety. It is when money takes on the additional function of store of value that our desire for it becomes unlimited. One idea I will therefore explore is the decoupling of money as medium of exchange from money as store of value. This idea has ancient roots going back to Aristotle, who distinguished between two kinds of wealth getting, for the sake of accumulation, and for the sake of meeting other needs. The former kind of wealth getting, he says, is unnatural and, moreover, bears no limit. Unlike physical goods, the abstraction of money allows us, in principle, to possess unlimited quantities of it. Thus it is easy for economists to believe in the possibility of endless exponential growth, where a mere number represents the size of the economy. The sum total of all goods and services is a number, and what limit is there on the growth of a number? Lost in abstraction, we ignore the limits of nature and culture to accommodate our growth. Following Plato, we make the abstraction more real than the reality, fixing Wall Street while the real economy languishes. The monetary essence of things is called value, which, as an abstracted, uniform essence, reduces the plurality of the world. All things are reduced to what they are worth. This gives the illusion that the world is as limitless as numbers are. For a price, you can buy anything, even the pelt of an endangered species. Implicit in the UN limit of money is another kind of limitlessness, that of the human domain, the part of the world that belongs to human beings. What kind of things, after all, do we buy and sell for money? We buy and sell property, things that we own, things that we perceive as belonging to us. Technology has constantly widened that domain, making things available for ownership that were never attainable or even conceivable before: minerals deep within the earth, bandwidth on the electromagnetic spectrum, sequences of genes. Contemporaneous with technological extension of our reach was the progression of the mentality of property, as things like land, water rights, music, and stories entered the realm of the owned. The UN limit of money implies that the realm of the owned can grow indefinitely, and therefore that the destiny of mankind is to conquer the universe, to bring everything into the human domain, to make the whole world ours. This destiny is part of what I have described as the myth of ascent, part of our defining story of the people. Today, that story is rapidly becoming obsolete, and we need to invent a money system aligned with the new story that will replace it. The features of money that I've discussed are not necessarily bad. By helping to homogenize or standardize all it touches, by serving as a universal means, money has enabled human beings to accomplish wonders. Money has played a key role in the rise of technological civilization, but perhaps, as with technology, we have barely begun to learn to use this potent creative instrument for its true purpose. Money has fostered the development of standardized things like machine components and microchips, but do we want our food to be homogeneous as well? Money's impersonality fosters cooperation over vast social distances, helping coordinate the labor of millions of people who are mostly strangers to each other. But do we want our relationships with the people in our own neighborhoods to be impersonal too? Money as universal means enables us to do nearly anything. But do we want it to be an exclusive means too, so that without it we can do nearly nothing? The time has come to master this tool, as humanity steps into an intentional, conscious new role on the earth. Chapter 4. The trouble with property. What would be the result in heaven itself if those who get there first instituted private property in the surface of heaven, and parceled it out in absolute ownership among themselves, as we parcel out the surface of the earth? Henry George Man did not make the earth, and, though he had a natural right to occupy it, he had no right to locate as his property in perpetuity any part of it. Neither did the creator of the earth open a land office, from whence the first title deeds should issue. Thomas Paine. The urge to own. We have lived in an age of separation. One by one, our bonds to community, nature, and place have dissolved, marooning us in an alien world. The loss of these bonds is more than a reduction of our wealth, it is a reduction of our very being. The impoverishment we feel, cut off from community and cut off from nature, is an impoverishment of our souls. That is because, contrary to the assumptions of economics, biology, political philosophy, psychology, and institutional religion, we are not in essence separate beings having relationships. We are relationship. I once heard Martin Prechtel, speaking of his village in Guatemala, explain, "In my village, if you went to the medicine man with a sick child, you would never say, 'I am healthy, but my child is sick.' You would say, 'My family is sick.' Or if it were a neighbor, you might say, 'My village is sick.' No doubt, in such a society, it would be equally inconceivable to say, 'I am healthy, but the forest is sick.' To think anyone could be healthy when her family, her village, or indeed the land, the water, or the planet were not, would be as absurd as saying, 'I've got a fatal liver disease, but that's just my liver, I am healthy.' Just as my sense of self includes my liver, so there's included their social and natural community. The modern self, in contrast, is a discrete and separate subject in a universe that is other. This self is the economic man of Adam Smith, it is the embodied soul of religion, it is the selfish gene of biology. It underlies the converging crises of our time, which are all variations on the theme of separation from nature, from community, from lost parts of ourselves. It underlies all the usual culprits blamed for the ongoing destruction of ecology and polity, such as human greed or capitalism. Our sense of self entails, more for me is less for you, hence we have an interest-based money system embodying precisely that principle. In older, gift-based societies, the opposite was true. The urge to own grows as a natural response to an alienating ideology that severs felt connections and leaves us alone in the universe. When we exclude world from self, the tiny, lonely identity that remains has a voracious need to claim as much as possible of that lost beingness for its own. If all the world, all of life and earth, is no longer me, I can at least compensate by making it mine. Other separate selves do the same. So we live in a world of competition and omnipresent anxiety. It is built into our self-definition. This is the deficit of being, the deficit of soul, into which we are born. Trapped in the logic of me and mine, we seek to recover some tiny fraction of our lost wealth by expanding and protecting the separate self and its extension, money and property. Those who lack the economic means to inflate the self often inflate the physical self instead, which is one reason why obesity disproportionately afflicts the poor. Addictions to shopping, to money, and to acquisition arise from the same basic source as do addictions to food. Both come from loneliness, from the pain of merely existing cut off from most of what we are. Looking out upon the strip mines and the clear cuts and the dead zones and the genocides and the debased consumer culture, we ask, what is the origin of this monstrous machine that chews up beauty and spits out money? The discrete and separate self, surveying a universe that is fundamentally other, naturally treats the natural and human world as a pile of instrumental, accidental stuff. The rest of the world is fundamentally not self. Why should we care about it, beyond our own foreseeable utility? So it was that Descartes, a pioneering articulator of the modern sense of self, articulated as well the ambition to become the lords and possessors of nature. As the latter word implies, the idea of property occurs quite naturally to the separate self. Our rigid, narrow, self/other distinction is coming to an end, victim of its own premises. As the mystics have taught, the separate self can be maintained only temporarily, and at great cost. And we have maintained it a long time, and built a civilization upon it that seeks the conquest of nature and human nature. The present convergence of crises has laid bare the futility of that goal. It portends the end of civilization as we know it, and the instauration of a new state of human beingness defined by a more fluid, more inclusive sense of self. One theory of the origin of property associates it with the notion of autonomy, or self-sovereignty, that emerged slowly out of our communal tribal past. Charles Evler describes the logic this way: if I am my own, and my labor power belongs to me, then what I make is mine. Here then is an ideological prerequisite for any concept of property, that I am my own, which is by no means a universal precept in human societies. In other societies, the clan, the tribe, the village, or even the community of all life may have taken priority over the individual conception of the self, in which case your labor power does not belong to you, but to something greater. The institution of property, therefore, is not the root of our present malady, but a symptom of our disconnection and isolation. This book, therefore, does not seek to abolish property, for to do so would address the symptom rather than the cause, but to transform it as part of a larger transformation of human beingness. Other thinkers, notably Wilhelm Reich and Genevieve Vaughan, link the origin of property to the emergence of male dominance and patriarchal society. While I believe these arguments have merit, I have chosen not to explore herein the sexual dimensions of money and property, a subject deserving of its own treatise. Each institution of our age of separation is tied to all the others. Alienation from nature, the body, and the sacred feminine echoes the alienation from the world that property implies when it makes things detachable objects of commerce. The urge to own diminishes as our sense of connectedness and gratitude grows, and we realize that our labor power is not our own, and what I make is not properly mine. Is not my ability to labor, and my life itself, a gift too? In that realization, we desire to give our creations to all that have contributed to our being and granted us the gift of life. Certain socialist philosophers have turned this desire, motivated by gratitude, into an obligation instead, and into a justification for state expropriation of individual labor. We owe a debt to society, and the state becomes the debt collector. In less extreme form, it justifies the income tax also in expropriation of individual labor. In both cases, we are compelled through force to give. Can we instead create an economic system that liberates, celebrates, and rewards the innate urge to give? That is what this book describes, a system that rewards flow and not accumulation, creating and not owning, giving and not having. The original robbery, the sovereignty of the individual, was but a first step toward the modern concept of property, for most things on this earth do not exist through anyone's labor. By the logic of what I make is mine, anything that existed independent of human effort could belong to no one. To claim ownership of such a thing, the land, the rivers, the animals, the trees, would be tantamount to theft, just as I am a thief if I seize ownership of something you make. A distinguished line of economic thought has arisen from this realization, whose most notable exponents were P.D. Proudhon, Karl Marx, Henry George, and Sylvia Gesell. Property is robbery, proclaimed Proudhon, tracing back the origin of any piece of property through a succession of legitimate transfers. We eventually get to the first owner, the one who simply took it, the one who separated it off from the realm of ours or God's into the realm of mine. Usually this happened by force, as in the seizure of the vast lands of all North America in the last 3 centuries. This story has played itself out in various forms for millennia all over the world. After all, before Roman times there was no such thing as a deed. Land was like the air and water, it could not be owned. The first owners therefore could not have acquired it legitimately. They must have taken it. It is often argued that land ownership is a natural consequence of agriculture. While the hunter-gatherer has made little investment in her land, the farmer has put labor into making it more productive, of food for humans, that is. It would be patently unjust for the farmer to labor all year only to have gatherers come in at harvest time and live off the harvest. Private property is supposed to give people an incentive to make improvements upon the land. But wouldn't it be more just if there was some way to own the improvements, and not the land itself? Originally, land rights were almost always held in common, accruing to the village or tribe, and not the individual. In the great agrarian civilizations such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Zhou dynasty China, there was little concept of private land ownership. All land was the property of the king, and because the king was the representative of the divine on earth, all land was the property of God. There is a vast conceptual gulf between having a right to the fruits of one's labor as applied to land and owning the land itself. In the West, The absolute concept of land ownership seems to have originated in Rome, fertilized, perhaps, by the Greek conception of the individual. It was in Rome that land first came under what they called dominium, the ultimate right. The right which had no right behind it. The right which legitimated all others, while itself having no need of legitimation. The right of using, enjoying, and abusing is utendi, fruendi, abutendi. In the East, explicit land ownership began somewhat earlier, at least in concept. In China it dates back at least to the reign of Shangyang in the 4th century BC and perhaps before, though even then a time prior to land ownership was still a matter of historical memory, as evidenced by Confucian statements that it was improper to sell land in ancient times. India as well probably knew private ownership of land by the 6th century BC, though the evidence is somewhat contradictory. In any event, the vast majority of land in India was communally owned up until the time of British rule. In medieval Europe, the bulk of the land was owned either in common or by feudal lords who did not own the land in the full modern sense, as an alienable commodity to freely buy and sell. They had certain rights to the land, which could be transferred to vassals in exchange for various services, shares of crops, and eventually for money. In England, free alienation of land was generally not possible until the 15th century. Thereafter, the vast communal lands of England rapidly came under private ownership thanks to the Enclosure Acts, a process paralleled across the continent, for example through the emancipation of the serfs. Lewis Hyde writes, whereas before a man could fish in any stream and hunt in any forest, now he found there were individuals who claimed to be the owners of these commons. The basis of land tenure had shifted. The medieval serf had been almost the opposite of a property owner. The land had owned him. He could not move freely from place to place, and yet he had inalienable rights to the piece of land to which he was attached. Now men claimed to own the land and offered to rent it out at a fee. While a serf could not be removed from his land, a tenant could be evicted not only through failure to pay the rent but merely at the whim of the landlord. As with so many social reforms, the freeing of the serfs was another step in the consolidation of economic and political power in the hands of the already powerful. By one means or another, people who had for generations freely grazed their herds, collected firewood, and hunted on the lands around them could no longer do so. These lands had been our commons, the property of all and of none. Forever after, they became property. If property is robbery, then a legal system dedicated to the protection of private property rights is a system that perpetuates a crime. By making property sacrosanct we validate the original theft. This should not be too surprising if the laws were made by the thieves themselves to legitimize their ill-gotten gains. Such was indeed the case, in Rome and elsewhere. It was the rich and powerful who both seized the land and made the laws. Lest the reader think I am launching a Marxist diatribe, let me hasten to add that I am not advocating the abolition of private property. For one thing, the whole mentality of abolition involves a fervid, abrupt, jarring change imposed forcefully on the unwilling. Secondly, private property is but a symptom of a deeper malady, separation, and if we address that symptom from the mindset of separation, of conquest, of overcoming evil, we will end up with the same iniquities in different forms. Finally, even on the economic level, the problem is not private property per se, but the unfair advantages of owning it. Even though it is wrong for someone to benefit from mere ownership of what was once common, everyone benefits when resources go toward those who will use them the best. These include the land, soil, minerals, aquifers, and capacity of the atmosphere to absorb waste. We need an economic system that disallows profit by owning yet rewards the entrepreneur's spirit that says, I know a way to use it better, and allows that spirit free rein. Marxist systems not only eliminate profit from exclusive control of scarce capital resources, they also eliminate profit from their efficacious use. The result is inefficiency and stagnation. Can we reward those who put resources to best use without rewarding the mere fact of ownership? This book describes a money system that preserves the freedom of private property without allowing its owners to accrue unfair advantages. Wherever and whenever it happened, the privatization of land soon brought with it a concentration of ownership. In the early days of ancient Rome, land was common, not personal, property, except for a small homestead plot. The corn land was of public right. As Rome expanded through conquest, the new lands did not stay public very long but soon migrated into the hands of the wealthiest families, the patrician class, setting the norm for many centuries to come. Their estates also grew at the expense of the original plebeian freeholds, whose owners were frequently called away to serve in the legions, and which in any case could not compete economically with the cheap slave labor of the patrician estates. They accumulated insurmountable debts and, because land had become an alienable commodity, were forced off their homesteads and into beggary, banditry, or, if they were fortunate, the urban craft professions. When the fortunes of the empire turned and the supply of slaves dried up, many large landholders turned to tenant farmers, the colony to farm their fields. Bound by debt, these tenants eventually became the medieval serfs. Think of it this way: if you owe me an insurmountable debt, then you are obliged to pay at least as much of it as you can. The proceeds of your labor, forever after, belong to me. How similar this is to the United States bankruptcy laws as promulgated in the Bankruptcy Reform Act of 2005, which compelled the person declaring bankruptcy to commit a portion of future wages to creditors. How similar as well to the plight of third world countries, who are compelled to restructure their economies and devote their entire economic surplus toward the perpetual servicing of debt. These are the modern counterparts of the serfs, bound to work for the owners of money just as the serfs worked for the owners of land. Their condition is known as debt-benage. The parallel between ancient Rome and the present day is striking. Now as then, wealth is increasingly concentrated in the hands of the few. Now as then, people must go into lifelong debt that they can never pay off just to have access to the necessities of life. Then it was through access to land, today it is through access to money. The slaves, serfs, and tenants gave a lifetime of labor to the enrichment of the landowners. Today the proceeds of our labor go to the owners of money. In the history of radical thought, the realization that property is theft usually accompanies a rage and desire for vengeance against the thieves. Matters are not so simple, though. The owners of wealth, whether inherited or not, are born into a role that is created and necessitated by the great invisible stories of our civilization that compel us to turn the world into property and money whether we are aware of doing so or not. Let us not waste our psychic energy hating the rich, or even the original plunderers. Cast in their station, we would have enacted the same role. Indeed, most of us participate, in one way or another, in the ongoing theft of the commons. Let us not hate, lest we prolong the age of separation even further and lest we, like the Bolsheviks, perpetrate a revolution that is insufficiently deep, and so recreate the old order in a different, distorted form. Still, let us not lose sight of the nature and effects of the unconscious crime of property, so that we may return our world to its original and still latent abundance. The transformation from a right to benefit into outright ownership of land was a gradual one, whose terminus is the practice of selling land for money. Let's keep in mind that this was a conceptual transformation. The land doesn't admit to being owned, a human projection onto reality. Land ownership, and indeed all forms of ownership, says more about our perception of the world than about the nature of the thing owned. The transition from the early days, when ownership of land was as unthinkable as ownership of the sky, sun, and moon, to the present day, when nearly every square foot of the earth is subject to ownership of one sort or another, is really just the story of our changing view of ourselves in relation to the universe. The Jorgist tradition, the distinction between the right to use and outright ownership echoes the primitive distinction between that which is produced through human effort and that which is there already. It persists today in the distinction between real and personal property, and it is a basis for thousands of years of reformist thought. Since the Roman Empire developed the legal basis of property rights as we know them today, it is unsurprising that it also produced some of the earliest critics of property. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, The early leaders of the Christian Church were especially clear that the things of the earth were for all to share. Ambrose wrote, "Rich and poor alike enjoy the splendid ornaments of the universe. The house of God is common to rich and poor, and the Lord our God has willed this earth to be the common possession of all and its fruit to support all." Elsewhere he writes that private property is not according to nature, for nature has brought forth all things for all in common. Thus God has created everything in such a way that all things be possessed in common. Nature therefore is the mother of common right, usurpation of private right. Others of the Christian fathers, notably John Chrysostom, Augustine, Basil the Great, and Clement, weighed in with similar views, encouraging followers to follow Jesus' teachings quite literally and give all their possessions to the poor. Theirs was not a detached philosophy. Many of these leaders did exactly that. Ambrose, Basil, and Augustine had been men of considerable wealth before entering the clergy, and they gave it all away. The teachings of its founders notwithstanding, eventually the Church itself acquired considerable property and allied itself with imperial power. The teachings of Jesus became otherworldly ideals that were not seriously recommended to anyone, and the kingdom of God was transported from earth to heaven. This was a major step in the conceptual separation of spirit and matter that has contributed to making materiality, and especially money, profane today. Even more ironically, most people today who profess to follow Christian teachings have turned everything inside out and associate socialism with atheism and private wealth with God's favor. The early church fathers made frequent reference to the distinction between what people produce through their own effort and what was given to humanity by God for all to use in common. Many social and economic critics of the last several centuries echoed this early indignation at the appropriation of the commons and developed creative proposals to remedy it. One such early critic, Thomas Paine, wrote, "And as it is impossible to separate the improvement made by cultivation from the earth itself, upon which that improvement is made, the idea of landed property arose from that parable connection, but it is nevertheless true, that it is the value of the improvement, only, and not the earth itself, that is individual property. Every proprietor, therefore, of cultivated lands, owes to the community a ground rent, for I know of no better term to express the idea, for the land which he holds." The first economist to develop this idea fully was Henry George, in his eloquent 1879 classic Progress and Poverty. He started with essentially the same premise as Paine and the early Christians, but who made the earth that any man can claim such ownership of it, or any part of it, or the right to give, sell or bequeath it. Since the earth was not made by us, but is only a temporary dwelling place on which one generation of men follow another, since we find ourselves here, are manifestly here with equal permission of the Creator, it is manifest that no one can have any exclusive right of ownership in land, and that the rights of all men to land must be equal and inalienable. There must be exclusive right of possession of land, for the man who uses it must have secure possession of land in order to reap the products of his labor. But his right of possession must be limited by the equal right of all, and should therefore be conditioned upon the payment to the community by the possessor of an equivalent for any special valuable privilege thus accorded him. Why should someone profit from the use value of land by the mere fact of owning it, especially when the origin of that ownership is based on ancient injustice? Accordingly, Henry George proposed his famous single tax, essentially a 100% tax on the economic rent deriving from land. This was to be implemented through a tax on the value of land as distinct from improvements upon it. For example, land would be taxed but not buildings or crops. It was called single because he advocated the abolition of all other taxes, reasoning that it is just as much theft to tax legitimate private property as it is to profit from something that belongs to all. George's writings sparked a massive political movement that almost got him elected to the New York mayor's office, but of course the established money power fought him at every turn. His ideas have been sporadically adopted around the world. The two places I've spent most of my life, Taiwan and Pennsylvania, both levy taxes on the underlying value of land, and have greatly influenced economic thought. One of his admirers, Sylvia Gesell, proposed a near equivalent to George's land tax, the public ownership of all land, available for private leasing at a rate that would approximate the economic rent. Gesell's reasoning is compelling and remarkably prescient in its understanding of ecology and the connected self. Read this extraordinary passage from 1906. We frequently hear the phrase, "Man has a natural right to the earth." But that is absurd, for it would be just as correct to say that man has a right to his limbs. If we talk of rights in this connection, we must also say that a pine tree has the right to sink its roots in the earth. Can man spend his life in a balloon? The earth belongs to, and is an organic part of man. We cannot conceive man without the earth any more than without a head or a stomach. The earth is just as much a part, an organ, of man as his head. Where do the digestive organs of man begin and end? They have no beginning and no end, but form a closed system without beginning or end. The substances which man requires to maintain life are indigestible in their raw state and must go through a preparatory digestive process. And this preparatory work is not done by the mouth, but by the plant. It is the plant which collects and transmutes the substances so that they may become nutriment in their further progress through the digestive canal. Plants and the space they occupy are just as much a part of man as his mouth, his teeth or his stomach. How, then, can we suffer individual men to confiscate for themselves parts of the earth as their exclusive property, to erect barriers and with the help of watchdogs and trained slaves to keep us away from parts of the earth, from parts of ourselves, to tear, as it were, whole limbs from our bodies? Is not such a proceeding equivalent to self-mutilation? Gesell goes on, with great rhetorical flourish, to say that this mutilation is even worse than the amputation of a body part, for wounds of the body heal, but the wound left by the amputation of a piece of land festers forever, and never closes. At every term for the payment of rent, on every quarter day, the wound opens and the golden blood gushes out. Man is bled white and goes staggering forward. The amputation of a piece of land from our body is the bloodiest of all operations. It leaves a gaping, festering wound which cannot heal unless the stolen limb is grafted on again. I think this is a wound we all feel, not only as the rent built into the cost of everything we buy, but also as a spiritual disenfranchisement. Some time ago I was driving with a woman from France down the country roads of central Pennsylvania. The gentle mountains and broad valleys beckoned to us, so we decided to walk them. It seemed as if the ground was begging for our feet, wanting to be tread. We decided to find a place to pull over and walk. We drove for an hour, but we never did find a field or forest that wasn't festooned with no trespassing signs. Every time I see one I feel a twinge, a loss. Any squirrel is freer than I am, any deer. These signs apply to humans only. Herein lies a universal principle: the regime of property, the enclosure of the unowned, has made us all poorer. The promise of freedom inherent in that broad, verdant landscape was a mirage. Woody Guthrie's words ring true: there was a big high wall that tried to stop me. The sign was painted, it said private property. But on the back side it didn't say nothing. That side was made for you and me. After 300 years of economic expansion, we are so impoverished that we lack the wealth and freedom of a squirrel. The indigenous people who lived here before the Europeans arrived had the run of the land. They had the simple freedom to say, "Let us climb that mountain. Let us swim in that lake. Let us fish that river." Not even the wealthiest among us have that freedom today. Even $1 billion landholding is smaller than the domain of the hunter-gatherer. The situation is different in most of Europe. In Sweden, for instance, the right of allemansrätt allows individuals to walk, pick flowers, camp for a day or two, swim, or ski on private land, but not to near a dwelling. I met a horse enthusiast who described how, in Ireland, all the gates to private farm lanes and pastures are unlocked. Trespassing is not a concept, the land is open to all. The riders are respectful of the farmer and the land in turn, sticking to the perimeters to avoid disturbing animals and pasture. Hearing of this system, I don't think any American can look out upon the vast expanses of this country with their gates, fences, and no trespassing signs without a feeling of confinement or loss. Can you feel Jessel's wound, that the very land has been severed from us? Jessel's huge contribution beyond George was to apply parallel thinking beyond land to money, inventing a new kind of money system that I will describe, after due groundwork, later in this book as a key element of a sacred economy. Controversial among progressives of his time, Henry George's insistence on taxing only land makes even less sense today because so many other commons have been brought into the realm of private property. Hyde's marketing of 4 million alienable properties has gone far beyond land to encompass nearly everything essential to human existence and human joy. Our connections to nature, to culture, and to community have been riven, separated off and sold back to us. I have so far focused on the land, but nearly every other commons has suffered the same fate. Intellectual property offers the most obvious example, and the royalties that derive from owning it play a role similar to land rent. If you think intellectual property differs from land because it is created by humans, read on, but there is one form of ownership that contains and supersedes the rest, the ownership of money. In the realm of finance, interest plays the role of royalties and rents, ensuring that the wealth that flows from human creativity and labor flows primarily to those who own money. Money is just as criminal in its origins as are other forms of property and ongoing robbery that both impels and embodies the expropriation of the commons. To restore sacredness to economy, we need to redress this robbery, because it is ultimately a theft and a reduction of a divine gift. It is the conversion of what was once sacred, unique, and personal into the status of commodity. It is not immediately obvious that the right to profit from mere ownership of money is just as illegitimate as the right to profit from the mere ownership of land. After all, money, unlike land, is a human creation. We earn money from the application of our human gifts, our own energy, time, and creativity. Surely the proceeds from this labor rightfully belong to the laborer? Surely, therefore, not all money is illegitimate in its ultimate origin? This view is naive. In fact, money is deeply and irretrievably implicated in the conversion of the land commons into private property, the final and defining stage of which is its reduction to the status of just another commodity that can be bought and sold. So too have other elements of our natural and cultural bequest been cordoned off, turned into property, and finally, as goods and services, into money. This is not to say that it is immoral to work for money, it is, rather, immoral for money to work for you. What rental is on land, so interest is on money. Money is the corpse of the commons, the embodiment of all that was once common and free, turned now into property of the purest form. The next several chapters will substantiate this claim, describing exactly how and why interest-bearing money, by nature, usurps the commons, ruins the planet, and reduces the vast majority of humanity to peonage.